Thomas Bennett stood at his kitchen window, absent-mindedly stirring his morning coffee while watching the autumn leaves dance across his well-maintained lawn. At 45, he had settled into a comfortable routine in the quiet suburb of Pine Grove, where the most exciting event was usually Mrs. Wilson's weekly bridge club meetings. That all changed when the moving truck materialized in a flash of purple light next door. Thomas nearly dropped his coffee mug. He blinked hard, convinced his eyes were playing tricks on him, but the iridescent vehicle remained parked in the driveway of the long empty house next door. As he watched, the back of the truck opened, revealing what appeared to be furniture that defied the laws of physics, pieces that shifted and transformed as they floated through the air. "Well, this is certainly different," he muttered to himself, setting down his mug with trembling hands. Just then, a figure emerged from the passenger side of the truck that made Thomas question everything he thought he knew about the universe. She, at least, Thomas assumed it was a she, stood nearly 7 feet tall, with skin that rippled like the surface of a pond in moonlight. Her form was gracefully proportioned but definitely not human, with 4 arms moving in perfect coordination as she directed the floating furniture. Most striking were her eyes, 3 of them, arranged in a triangle pattern, each one shifting through all the colors of the rainbow. Thomas wasn't sure how long he stood there staring, but he was jolted from his trance by a gentle tap on his shoulder. He spun around with a yelp, finding himself face to face with the alien being who had somehow entered his house without making a sound. "Greetings, neighbor," her voice chimed like crystal wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "I am Nyara, recently assigned to this sector for xenological research. I hope my arrival hasn't startled you too severely." Thomas opened and closed his mouth several times before managing to speak. Welcome to the neighborhood. I'm Thomas. Thomas Bennett." He extended his hand automatically, then wondered if handshakes were even a thing where she came from. Nyara looked at his outstretched hand with obvious curiosity, all 3 eyes focusing on it intently. Then, to Thomas's surprise, she reached out with her upper right hand and shook his, while her other 3 hands performed what appeared to be an intricate greeting gesture. "How fascinating," she exclaimed. "You humans have such wonderful customs. I've studied Earth culture extensively, but experiencing it firsthand is quite different." Her skin rippled with patterns of light that somehow conveyed both excitement and warmth. Before Thomas could respond, a crash from outside drew their attention. Mrs. Wilson stood frozen in her driveway, her grocery bags scattered around her feet, staring at the still materializing furniture next door. Her mouth hung open in a perfect O of shock. "Oh dear," Nyara's voice took on a concerned tone. "Perhaps I should have followed standard first contact protocols. But you see, I was so excited about my assignment here, and your species has such interesting mating rituals that I simply couldn't wait to begin my research." Thomas choked on air. "Mating rituals?" "Yes." Nyara's skin brightened enthusiastically. "That's my primary field of study. The various ways sentient species form pair bonds and reproduce. Earth's diversity in this area is particularly fascinating. Did you know you're one of only 3 known planets where the dominant species uses romantic love as a primary mate selection criterion?" As Thomas struggled to process this information, Mrs. Wilson seemed to recover her composure enough to start screaming. "Aliens! The aliens are invading! Everyone run!" "Oh my," Nyara's skin dimmed to a concerned purple. "This seems to be going rather poorly. Thomas, would you mind helping me explain to your fellow human that I'm not here to invade? I'd hate to have to file an incident report on my first day." Thomas looked from his unexpected alien guest to his panicking neighbor, and then at the small crowd beginning to gather on the street. His quiet, predictable life had just become anything but, and somehow, he found himself more intrigued than frightened. "Sure," he heard himself say. "But maybe we should start with coffee? Or whatever the equivalent is where you're from." Nyara's skin sparkled with delight. "That would be wonderful. Though I should warn you, my species' version of a stimulating beverage tends to make things float. As Thomas led his new neighbor to the kitchen, he couldn't help but wonder what other surprises lay in store. One thing was certain: life in Pine Grove would never be the same again. The following week proved to be an education in interstellar relations that Thomas never expected to receive. After helping Nyara calm the neighborhood's initial panic, which involved a rather interesting town hall meeting where she demonstrated her species' harmless nature by making everyone's coffee cups float in perfect synchronization, life in Pine Grove settled into a new kind of normal. Thomas found himself becoming Nyara's unofficial cultural ambassador, partly because she'd taken to appearing in his kitchen every morning. Apparently, her species had a rather loose concept of personal space, and partly because he was the only one who didn't run away screaming when her skin started glowing with excitement. "I still don't understand why humans insist on using vehicles that don't hover," Nyara mused one morning, all three of her eyes focused on the traffic passing by Thomas's front window. "It seems terribly inefficient." Thomas sipped his coffee, having grown accustomed to the way it occasionally lifted itself to his lips when Nyara was particularly animated. "We're working on it. But you have to admit, we've made pretty good progress for a species that only recently figured out how to leave our own atmosphere." Nyara's skin rippled with what Thomas had come to recognize as affectionate amusement. "True. Your rate of technological advancement is quite remarkable. Though your social evolution is what really interests me." She paused, her middle eye shifting to a deep blue. "Speaking of which, would you be willing to assist me with an experiment?" Thomas had learned to be wary of that tone. Last week's experiment had resulted in every plant in his garden developing consciousness and forming a union to demand better working conditions. "What kind of experiment?" "Oh, nothing too dramatic," Nyara assured him, though the way her skin sparkled suggested otherwise. "I'm studying human courtship rituals, and I've noticed that your species puts great emphasis on something called dating. Would you consider participating in one with me?" "For research purposes, of course." Thomas nearly choked on his coffee, which chose that moment to do a somersault in midair. "You want to go on a date? With me?" "Precisely." Nyara beamed, causing the lights in the room to flicker. "I've already prepared a detailed research protocol. We'll need to engage in traditional human courtship activities while I monitor your physiological responses. I'm particularly interested in the phenomenon you call butterflies in the stomach. Do they hurt when they emerge?" That's not quite how it works," Thomas stammered, feeling his face grow warm. "And wouldn't this be a bit inappropriate? I mean, you're here as a researcher, and I'm supposed to be helping you adjust to Earth." Nyara's skin dimmed slightly. "Oh, have I violated a taboo? My preliminary research indicated that humans often combine professional and personal relationships. Is this not correct?" Before Thomas could respond, a knock at the door saved him from having to explain the complexities of human workplace romance to an alien anthropologist. It was Mrs. Wilson, who had gradually warmed to their extraterrestrial neighbor after Nyara had used her telekinetic abilities to rescue Mr. Whiskers from a tree. "Thomas, dear," Mrs. Wilson said, pointedly ignoring the way her hair was starting to float in Nyara's excited presence, "the neighborhood committee is meeting tonight to discuss the unusual changes to our community. We'd appreciate it if you and your friend would attend." "Of course we'll come." Nyara chimed in before Thomas could respond. "I've been studying human group decision-making processes. This will be perfect for my research." Her skin pulsed with rainbow patterns of enthusiasm. Mrs. Wilson managed a weak smile. "Wonderful. And dear," she added, turning to Nyara, "perhaps you could avoid making the refreshments levitate this time? Mrs. Henderson is still recovering from the floating punch bowl incident." After Mrs. Wilson left, Nyara turned all three of her color-shifting eyes on Thomas. "This is perfect timing. Human social gatherings are often contexts for courtship behaviors. We can begin our dating experiment tonight." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, wondering how to explain that a neighborhood committee meeting wasn't exactly an ideal first date setting. But looking at Nyara's earnest expression and the way her skin shimmered with anticipation, he found himself nodding. "All right," he said, "but we should probably establish some ground rules. First, no making anything float unless absolutely necessary. Second, try to avoid mentioning your research into human mating habits. And third..." He paused, realizing with a start that he was actually looking forward to this bizarre situation. "Maybe we could get dinner before the meeting? You know, for thorough research purposes." Nyara's skin erupted in a dazzling light show that briefly knocked out power to the entire block. "Wonderful. I've been eager to try this pizza phenomenon I've heard so much about. Did you know that your species is one of only 12 that deliberately applies thermal energy to organic matter before consumption? Fascinating." As Thomas watched Nyara excitedly take notes on her holographic tablet, which had a tendency to project its contents into the actual air around them, he couldn't help but smile. His life had certainly become more complicated since she arrived, but it had also become infinitely more interesting. And if he was being honest with himself, the idea of going on a date with an alien xenologist didn't seem nearly as strange as it should have. "Just promise me one thing," he said as Nyara's tablet projected a three-dimensional diagram of human courtship patterns into his living room. "No dissecting my emotions. Metaphorically or literally." Nyara's skin flickered with what might have been disappointment. "Very well. Though I must note that my species' method of emotional analysis is completely non-invasive. Usually." The local pizzeria wasn't quite prepared for Nyara. Thomas watched with a mixture of amusement and mortification as she analyzed each ingredient with her portable scanner, causing the pepperoni to briefly achieve consciousness and attempt to escape from the pizza. "Fascinating," Nyara exclaimed, her skin pulsing with excited purple waves as she documented the pepperoni's brief sentience. "The combination of Earth proteins and consciousness-raising energy fields produces the most unexpected results." The other diners were trying their best to pretend they weren't watching, though it was hard to ignore a 7-foot-tall, three-eyed alien whose skin kept changing colors while making food achieve temporary sapience. Thomas took a careful bite of his own slice, grateful that at least it wasn't trying to have a philosophical discussion with him. "You know," he said carefully, "most human dates involve a bit less scientific observation and a bit more conversation." Nyara's middle eye swirled with interest while the other two continued monitoring her instruments. "Oh? What should we converse about? I have several prepared questions about human reproductive habits." "Maybe we could start with something simpler," Thomas interrupted hastily, noticing the nearby families starting to look concerned. "Like, what made you choose Earth for your research?" Nyara's skin shifted to a contemplative blue shade. "Well, officially, I'm here because Earth represents a unique convergence of biological and social evolution. Your species developed complex emotional bonds before achieving interstellar travel, which is quite rare." She paused, her three eyes synchronizing into a warm golden color. "Unofficially, I've always been fascinated by humans. You're so unpredictable, so passionate. Most species follow logical progression in their development, but humans? You create art before solving basic survival problems. You form deep emotional attachments to non-sentient creatures. You invented pizza." Thomas couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm. "We are pretty strange, aren't we?" "Wonderfully strange," Nyara agreed, her skin sparkling. "For instance, right now your heart rate has increased by 12.3%, your pupils are dilated, and you're exhibiting several other signs of attraction, yet you're trying to pretend this is just a normal meal between colleagues." Thomas choked on his pizza. You can measure my vital signs?" "Oh yes, my species naturally perceives biorhythms. It's quite helpful for research. Also," she added, her skin taking on a rosy hue, you should know that the shimmer patterns I'm displaying are typically associated with romantic interest in my culture." Before Thomas could process this revelation, his phone buzzed with a reminder. "The neighborhood meeting," he exclaimed, partly relieved for the interruption. "We should get going." The community center was packed and they arrived, with what seemed like every resident of Pine Grove in attendance. Mrs. Wilson stood at the podium, trying to maintain order as various neighbors argued about the recent changes to their quiet suburb. "The property values are being affected," Mr. Johnson from 2 streets over was saying. "My petunias started singing opera yesterday." "My lawn mower achieved sentience and unionized," another resident complained. "The book club books are now reading themselves." Mrs. Wilson banged her gavel, which promptly floated out of her hand. Nyara looked slightly embarrassed and quickly returned it. "Please, everyone. We're here to have a civilized discussion about our unique situation." Thomas felt Nyara's lower right hand slip into his. "Their biosignatures indicate significant stress," she whispered. "Perhaps I should explain about the temporary nature of consciousness-raising field effects?" But before she could step forward, a new voice cut through the chaos. "This is exactly what I warned you about." Everyone turned to see Dr. Harrison, the local physicist, standing up with a thick folder in his hands. "I've been monitoring the anomalies since our extraterrestrial neighbor arrived. The fabric of reality in Pine Grove is becoming increasingly unstable." He projected a series of graphs onto the wall, showing various spikes and patterns. "The concentration of what I call weird energy has increased exponentially. If this continues, who knows what could happen? We could have a full reality breakdown." The room erupted in panicked murmurs. Thomas felt Nyara's hand tighten in his as her skin dimmed to a worried gray. "Oh dear," she said softly. "I may have forgotten to mention that my species' emotional states can have certain effects on local quantum fields. And lately, my emotions have been particularly intense." Thomas looked at her, then at the frightened faces of his neighbors, then back at the graphs showing reality starting to unravel around their small suburb. "Let me guess," he said with a slight smile, "this isn't exactly covered in the standard first contact protocols." Nyara's skin swirled with patterns of anxiety and something else, something that made the air between them seem to sparkle. "Not exactly. Especially since the primary cause appears to be." She hesitated, all 3 eyes fixing on Thomas. "My growing feelings for you." The lights in the community center flickered, and somewhere in the distance, they could hear Mr. Whiskers beginning to recite Shakespeare. The community center erupted into chaos following Nyara's revelation. Reality itself seemed to be responding to the tension. The walls rippled like waves on a pond, chairs began sprouting flowers, and the emergency exit sign started offering philosophical advice about escaping one's existential constraints. "Everyone, please remain calm," Mrs. Wilson shouted, though her authority was somewhat undermined by the fact that she was now floating 6 inches off the ground. "I'm sure there's a rational explanation for all of this." Dr. Harrison waved his instruments frantically. "Rational? The quantum probability fields are completely destabilized. Love between a human and an alien is causing a breakdown in the fundamental forces of the universe." Thomas felt a strange calm descend over him as he watched his neighbors panic. He turned to Nyara, whose skin had taken on a swirling pattern of deep blues and uncertain purples. "Is he right? Are your feelings for me really causing all this?" Nyara's 3 eyes focused on him, each one shimmering with different emotions. "My species experiences emotions, intensely. When we form romantic attachments, it can affect the quantum substrate of reality. Usually, this isn't a problem on my homeworld. Our entire civilization is built to accommodate these effects. But here on Earth..." She gestured at the chaos around them, where the potted plants had begun a synchronized dance routine. "I should leave," she continued, her skin dimming to a sorrowful gray. "My presence is clearly causing too much disruption to your world." I'll submit my resignation to the Xenological Research Committee N. No, Thomas interrupted, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. He took both of her right hands in his. Running away isn't the solution. We just need to figure out how to control these effects. Control them? Dr. Harrison scoffed, his hair now standing on end from the ambient energy in the room. The laws of physics aren't meant to bend this way. The more their emotional connection grows, the worse it will get. As if to prove his point, reality hiccuped. For a brief moment, everyone in the room experienced what it was like to be a potted fern. Mrs. Wilson's cat, Mr. Whiskers, who had somehow appeared in the community center, began explaining string theory to a bewildered audience. Actually, Nyara said thoughtfully, her skin beginning to brighten, there might be a way. On my world, we use specialized quantum harmonizers to stabilize reality around strong emotional nexuses. I could modify my research equipment to serve a similar function, but... She hesitated, all three eyes turning to Thomas. It would mean officially acknowledging our relationship. In my culture, using harmonizers is essentially the equivalent of, well, marriage. The room fell silent, even the reality-warped objects seeming to hold their breath. Thomas felt every eye, human and otherwise, turned to him. His mind raced with the implications. He'd known Nyara for less than 2 weeks, and now he was contemplating what amounted to an interspecies marriage to save the fabric of reality in Pine Grove. I know it's a lot to ask, Nyara continued, her skin flickering with nervous energy that made several chairs start tap dancing. Especially given how briefly we've known each other. But Thomas. Her voice softened. I've studied countless species across the galaxy, and I've never encountered anyone who makes me feel the way you do. You're kind, and curious, and you didn't run away screaming when I accidentally made your toaster achieve enlightenment. Thomas couldn't help but smile at that. That toaster did give some pretty good advice about living in the moment. See? That's exactly what I mean. You adapt, you accept, you find humor in the strange and beautiful. Nyara's skin was now pulsing with patterns that made the air around them shimmer with possibilities. I know this isn't a traditional human courtship, but then again, nothing about us has been traditional. Dr. Harrison's instruments were beeping frantically. The quantum field fluctuations are reaching critical levels. Whatever you're going to do it fast. Thomas looked around the room at his neighbors, people he'd known for years, whose lives had been turned upside down by Nyara's arrival. But he also saw how many of them were smiling now, despite their concern. Mrs. Wilson was actually dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief that had started writing poetry about the moment. He turned back to Nyara, who waited with all three eyes fixed on him, her skin swirling with hope and fear and what he now recognized as love. The answer, he realized, had been obvious from the moment she appeared in his kitchen that first morning. Well, he said, squeezing her hands gently, I suppose we should start working on those harmonizers. Though I have to warn you, human wedding receptions usually don't involve quite so much quantum physics. Nyara's joy erupted in a display of light and color that momentarily transformed the community center into a crystalline cathedral of pure energy. As reality slowly settled back into its normal patterns, Thomas heard Mrs. Wilson say, well, I suppose we'll need to update the neighborhood association bylaws to account for interspecies marriages. Mr. Whiskers, still channeling unusual wisdom, purred, love, like quantum entanglement, transcends all conventional understanding of space and time. Thomas couldn't have agreed more. The next few weeks in Pine Grove were a whirlwind of activity as Thomas and Nyara worked to stabilize both reality and their unconventional relationship. The quantum harmonizers, which looked like iridescent wind chimes that played music in 5 dimensions, were installed throughout the neighborhood. While they didn't completely eliminate the reality-warping effects of their love, they did make them more manageable and even beautiful. I think we've finally got the calibration right, Nyara announced one morning, all 3 of her eyes gleaming with satisfaction as she adjusted the final harmonizer. Her skin rippled with gentle waves of contentment that now only caused slight luminescence in nearby plants rather than full consciousness-raising events. Thomas watched from their front porch, sipping his coffee which, true to form, still occasionally floated but no longer tried to achieve escape velocity. "How can you tell?" "Well, Mr. Whiskers is back to speaking only in regular cat language instead of quantum physics," she replied, settling beside him with her own beverage, a shimmering liquid that changed flavors based on her mood. "Though I think Mrs. Wilson misses their discussions about the nature of free will." The mention of their elderly neighbor made Thomas smile. Mrs. Wilson had become their strongest advocate, especially after Nyara had used her abilities to create a garden where the flowers arranged themselves into different patterns each morning. The neighborhood association had even officially amended its bylaws to include reality-affecting events of an extraterrestrial nature under acceptable community activities, provided they were properly harmonized. "Speaking of the neighbors," Thomas said, "how's your research coming along? Still studying human mating rituals?" Nyara's skin flushed with a mix of professional pride and personal embarrassment. "Actually, I've had to revise my entire thesis." The Xenological Research Committee was particularly interested in how human adaptability and emotional resilience can stabilize quantum fluctuations. "Our relationship has become something of a case study in interspecies harmony." "Is that what we're calling it?" Thomas laughed, gesturing at their front yard where the grass had started humming a gentle symphony. "Harmony? Well, perhaps a creative chaos would be more accurate," Nyara admitted, her eyes twinkling in 3 different colors. "But that's what I love about being here with you. Humans don't just adapt to the impossible, you embrace it, reshape it, make it part of your world." As if to prove her point, a group of neighborhood children ran past their house, playing what they dubbed quantum tag, a game that took advantage of the occasional reality ripples to make the game more interesting. Their laughter echoed with slight dimensional harmonics, a sound that had become as normal in Pine Grove as birdsong. Dr. Harrison, who had initially been their strongest critic, now spent his days eagerly documenting the effects of emotional quantum mechanics on local spacetime. He'd even started a weekly lecture series called Love and Physics, an interdimensional perspective, at the community center. "You know," Thomas said, taking Nyara's lower right hand in his, "when you first appeared in my kitchen, I thought my quiet life was over. Turns out it was just beginning." Nyara's skin erupted in patterns that expressed deeper emotions than human languages had words for. "I came to Earth to study human love," she said softly, "but I never expected to experience it myself. Your species has such a remarkable capacity for connection. You don't just observe the universe, you engage with it, change it, fill it with meaning." A gentle breeze carried the sound of Mr. Whiskers reciting one final snippet of quantum poetry before returning to regular meows. In the distance, the quantum harmonizers chimed in perfect resonance with the emotional energy flowing between Thomas and Nyara. "The Xenological Research Committee has asked me to extend my stay indefinitely," Nyara continued, her skin now glowing with hopeful anticipation. "They believe our relationship provides valuable insights into cross-species understanding." "Of course, that's just the official reason. Unofficially." She squeezed Thomas's hand, sending small sparks of joy dancing through the air. "I can't imagine being anywhere else." Thomas pulled her close, no longer worried about the slight reality distortions that their contact created. The roses in their garden might spontaneously rearrange themselves into love sonnets, and the laws of physics might need occasional reminders to behave themselves, but that was just life now in Pine Grove. "I suppose this means we'll have to start planning that wedding," he mused. "Though I'm not sure how we'll combine Earth traditions with your species' quantum marriage ceremonies." Nyara's eyes sparkled with mischief. "Well, I was thinking we could have the ceremony in the community center. Mrs. Wilson can officiate, she's been studying both human marriage laws and quantum entanglement theory. And for the reception," her skin rippled with excited energy, "we could create a temporary pocket dimension where the laws of physics are more flexible." As Thomas laughed and pulled her into a kiss that made the streetlights dance and the air sing with possibility, he reflected that love, like science, was all about exploring the unknown. Sometimes the most remarkable discoveries happened not in laboratories or distant galaxies, but in the heart of a quiet suburban neighborhood where an ordinary man and an extraordinary alien had proven that even reality itself would bend to accommodate true connection. The quantum harmonizers hummed in approval, and somewhere in the multiverse, a toaster achieved enlightenment once again.